The first stone slammed down before sunrise. Not some neat little brick, but a jagged, thigh-sized boulder, dropped with such force the earth trembled a bit beneath her boots. Her fingers were raw from dragging it up the hill herself, her back slick with sweat, though frost still clung to the tall grass. Her newborn boy slept in a bundled crate by the fire pit, belly full from the last of the goat's milk. He had no father anymore, no uncles, no neighbors willing to offer a plank, much less a hand, and still she built. Martha Ellen Greeley was 29 when her husband's heart gave out chopping firewood. He dropped like a felled pine, barely 6 paces from the cabin they were renting on the McIntyre claim. No warning, no time for a goodbye. By the time she reached him, he was already gone, eyes open to the sky like he'd seen something awful or beautiful at the last breath. 2 days later, the landowner told her to pack up and clear out. The land was spoken for again, leased to a logging crew out of Kansas. Her belly was near to bursting. The snow was coming early this year. No one wanted to take her in, not with a baby on the way, not when food stores were already thin, not with a widow's luck hanging over her head like a curse. That's when she did something that made the rest of the settlers snicker behind their fences. She dragged her wagon north, past the cedar line, and staked out a patch of raised granite about a mile from town. "Fools building on a rock shelf," they said at the saloon. "Gonna have her house tipped sideways come thaw. What's she thinking? That baby'll be blue 'fore the roof's on?" They didn't see what she saw. Or maybe they just never looked hard enough to notice the bluff dipped into a shallow bowl, naturally shielded from the wind. Or how water trickled just beneath a fault in the stone, enough to keep a barrel fed if you knew where to dig. Or how stone held heat longer than timber, if you knew how to use it. And Martha knew. Her father had been a stonemason in Kentucky before he lost his hand in a quarry blast. She grew up with mortar under her fingernails and summers spent hauling lime and shale. She remembered the way heat pooled in the limestone walls of their house long after the fire had gone out. She remembered the sound of wind clawing the rafters while they sat warm as toast on the hearthstone. So no, she didn't want timber. She wanted stone. The first week she slept in the wagon with her baby, rifle across her lap. Coyotes howled at night. Snow flurried one morning before the leaves had even finished falling. Her hands split from the cold, but every day she walked the ridge, hauling and hammering, building a square frame of stone 4 feet high and thick as her arm span. The men in town started taking bets on how long she'd last. Nobody wagered past the first frost. She didn't go back to town for help, not even when the baby got colic and screamed for 3 nights straight, not even when she coughed blood one morning after hauling stones through a storm. On the 4th week, she began the chimney. One man, Isaiah Boone, a farmer with 7 kids, rode out to see what she was doing. He claimed he came to offer firewood, but she saw the disbelief in his eyes. He looked at the stone walls, then at her bare, bruised arms, then at the infant sleeping in a sling against her chest. "This ain't a sane place to raise a child," he said gently. "I don't need sanity. I need warmth," she answered, not looking up from her mortar mix. He left without another word. The trouble came in late October. She'd nearly finished the roof, tarred canvas over split logs pegged into a stone rim. But the foundation hadn't cured right in one corner. A storm rolled in heavy, and the wind howled hard enough to rattle the whole frame. That night one of the stones shifted. She felt it, woke up to a soft thump, then another. Then the roof dipped in one corner. She snatched the baby from his bed of blankets and ran barefoot into the snow, just as the top third of the south wall collapsed. The canvas roof sagged, part of it tore loose. The chimney held, but just barely. She stared at the wreck, baby wailing in her arms, and for the first time since her husband died, she almost screamed with rage. She wanted to throw something, to break the rest of it down, to fall to her knees and sob. Instead, she strapped the baby to her chest, grabbed her spade, and worked until her knuckles bled. By the time November came, she'd rebuilt the wall thicker, deeper into the slope. She lined the interior with salvaged clay bricks, one by one, found a way to create a narrow drainage channel beneath the floor, using fire-blackened tiles from an old sawmill dump. She built the hearth in the center, not on the wall like most cabins, so the heat would reach every corner. She hung tin pots around the perimeter to radiate warmth. She packed sheep's wool into the roof beams. She used everything she had learned from her father's stone house, and more. When she finally lit the hearth and sealed the door, the smoke rose straight, clean, and proud. The baby slept through the night. No drafts, no cough, just the crackle of fire and the whisper of survival. And then the first real blizzard hit. It came howling down from the north, a full week earlier than anyone predicted. Roofs collapsed in town, sheds caved in, the preacher's horse froze in its stall. 2 children died of exposure trying to walk from the schoolhouse back home. But on the ridge, in that squat, ugly, heavy-walled thing she'd built with her bare hands, the widow's fire kept burning. Inside, the heat pooled in the stones like blood in a heart. It bled warmth, all through the night. The baby didn't even stir, and when morning came, Martha stepped outside, with frost on her lashes, smoke rising from her chimney, and the wind couldn't touch her. No one laughed that day, but they started whispering, "She's still up there. Somehow. Maybe that stone's not so foolish after all." Yet the worst wasn't over, because as more storms came, and her shelter proved stronger than anyone's, some settlers started looking at her little fortress with hungry eyes, and on one bitter night in December, as the wind screamed louder than ever, someone knocked at her door, not with hands, but with the butt of a rifle. The knock didn't come as a courtesy, it came as a command. A heavy, muffled blow of wood against stone and iron, 3 times in quick succession. Not frantic, not desperate, deliberate. Martha had been nursing the baby by the hearth when it happened, half asleep in the fire's lull, her hand resting on the cradle with the child bundled inside. Her first instinct was to go still, listen. The wind shrieked through the crevices in the slope above, but it couldn't mask the sound of boots shifting outside. More than one pair. She didn't speak, didn't ask, "Who's there?" like a fool in a penny novel. Instead, she eased the baby deeper into his wrap, kissed his cheek once, then reached up to the mantel. The rifle was there, always loaded, hammer back just enough to snap with a flick. She cocked it silently, stood, and stepped lightly toward the door, making sure her boots didn't echo on the flagstone floor. Another knock, closer this time. At the wooden center of the door, not the edge. A voice followed. "Martha Greeley, we come peaceable." 3 men then, possibly 4. One sounded older, raspy, maybe Amos Harlan, the shopkeep. Another had a younger rasp, tighter, impatient. Could be one of the Moss brothers, always swaggering about town like they owned the place. The third didn't speak. She didn't open the door. "You're not here for peace if you bring guns," she said, voice flat. "Now hold on," the older voice returned, soft like worn gloves. "Ain't no need for threats. Just wanted a word. Cold snaps getting worse. Snows past the eaves in town." She said nothing. "Came to ask if you might extend some warmth. We got 2 little ones at the Moss cabin downriver. Their stove's cracked." "I built this alone," she replied. "Built it for my son. You laughed at me then, and now you come knocking." A pause, then the younger voice snapped, sharper, irritated. "You think you're better than us, huh? Think just 'cause you got rocks piled high, you can turn your nose up? I think my son's alive because of what I built. That's all I care about." The silence outside changed then, hardened. A boot shuffled against gravel. The older man murmured something too soft to catch. The third man finally spoke, low, deep, and close to the door. "You don't open this door. We'll open it ourselves." She didn't wait. The rifle barked once, aimed high through the stone slit she'd carved for ventilation just above the lintel. The shot went wide on purpose, no intent to kill, just to warn. The blast echoed like a cannon in the bowl-shaped bluff, and the wind caught the sound and scattered it far. Footsteps retreated. "You fire again," the young one shouted as they backed down the trail. "We won't knock next time." She stayed at the door long after their steps faded. The next 3 nights passed without sleep. She sat at the hearth with the rifle and baby both in arm's reach, fire banked low to avoid casting too much glow through the slats. Every sound from the slope above prickled her neck, a shifting stone, a cracking branch, snow sliding off the canvas roof like breath off skin. Her baby, Thomas, cooed in his sleep. That sound was her only peace. By the 2nd week of December, half the valley had frozen solid. 3 cabins had collapsed under snow weight. A barn fire claimed every mule on the north end. 1 child lost his toes. Another family was found unconscious in their cabin, passed out from fumes when their chimney backed up. The saloon shut down. The preacher stopped holding services. Even the mail riders gave up trying to pass the ridge. Nothing moved but smoke and rumor. And through it all, Martha's fire kept burning. She rationed wood like gold, boiled melted snow with ashes to keep it clean, wrapped Thomas in lambskin inside a hollow she'd carved beneath the hearthstone itself, close enough to be warm, far enough to breathe freely. She sang to him quietly each night, old tunes her mother used to hum while stirring biscuit dough or folding linens, now cracked and raw in her throat. The cabin held, but her food was near gone. By the 3rd week, she knew she'd have to leave, just for a day, just long enough to reach the old Pritchard cabin 2 miles downslope, abandoned since summer. Maybe it still held canned beans or flour, maybe a broken crate of oats, anything. She waited until dawn, left Thomas wrapped tight in the fire-warmed cradle, waited with stones for heat, rifle beside him in case she didn't return. It was 10 below zero outside. The sky was white, cloudless, hollow. Snow reached her waist on the westward trail, but she knew a deer path along the rocks. She moved quick, shoulders wrapped in the last of her husband's coat, boots lined with rabbit fur, eyes red from smoke and sleeplessness. The bluff vanished behind her within minutes. The wind stole her breath, stung her eyelids until tears froze in the corners. Every step was a prayer. She reached the Pritchard place by mid-morning. The door was off its hinges, the roof caved in one corner, but inside, beneath a half-fallen cupboard, She found a sack of beans. Mice had gotten into half, but the rest was sealed. A tin of lard, 2 moldy biscuits, a single rusted tin of peaches. She took it all. She should have gone back then. But she heard something, a faint, distant sound, a child crying. It came from the grove downhill, a patch of ash trees clustered like soldiers in the snow, half buried and dark. Martha's heart jumped. She stood frozen, sack in hand, unsure if it was wind or memory or worse. But it came again, louder, thin, pained. She dropped the food behind a stump and trudged toward the sound. There, at the edge of the grove, was a girl. 6, maybe 7, pale as snow, barefoot, wrapped in what looked like a rug. Her lips were purple, her breath a whisper of fog. "Where's your family?" Martha asked, kneeling fast. The girl's eyes were wide, but she didn't answer. She just pointed. Martha followed the gesture. 20 paces into the grove, barely visible under a snow-laden tarp, was a collapsed sled. A man slumped beside it, arm draped over something hidden. His face was blue, frozen stiff. A woman lay half-covered in snow nearby. 2 other children were bundled together beneath the tarp, unmoving. She didn't think. She acted. She grabbed the girl first, wrapped her in the sack she'd brought for food, then dragged the tarp loose. The boy beneath it was barely conscious, breathing shallow, lips cracked. The youngest, maybe 3, didn't move at all. She wrapped them all in her coat, yanked a sled's leather strap free, and tied the ends around her waist. Then she pulled, through snow that reached her ribs, through wind that cut her ears. 1 step, then another. It took 3 hours to climb back to the bluff. By the time she reached the stone cabin, she couldn't feel her legs. Her lips bled. Her arms trembled so violently she dropped the door latch twice before she could open it. Inside, the fire was low. Her son still slept, swaddled tight in his hearth nest, cheeks flushed with heat. She sobbed once, just once, then laid the 3 children near the fire, built the flame back up, and worked to revive them with hot cloths, rubbed limbs, broth from melted snow. The youngest didn't wake, the other 2 did. She gave them all her blankets. She didn't sleep that night. 2 days later, their names came back to her. Samantha, the eldest girl. William, the middle boy. They were the Harrow children, from the far side of the valley. Their parents had tried to reach town through the grove. They hadn't made it. The family had set off after their roof caved in, and their stove cracked wide. Martha didn't tell the children what she saw. She just held them. And now, inside that stone foundation the settlers once mocked, 4 children survived the blizzard. 4, and more would come, because 2 nights after the rescue, as she stood by the fire stirring beans, another knock came. This one was different, lighter, softer. A woman's voice called out, "Please, I have nothing, not even shoes. My boy's sick. We saw the smoke." Martha stepped to the door and opened it. There stood a mother in rags, clutching a shivering boy no older than Thomas. Her lips trembled, eyes wide. "I can sleep outside," the woman said quickly. "Just let him warm up, just for a bit. I won't stay." Martha said nothing. She took the boy in her arms, turned, and nodded toward the fire. "Come in. Close the door fast. We don't waste heat here." The woman stared for a breath, then stepped inside. The stone walls took them in. The fire held. By New Year's Eve, the stone cabin held 9 souls. 9, 7 children, 4 of them not her own, and 2 women, herself and Anna Coleridge, the barefoot mother who arrived half-frozen with her feverish son cradled in her arms. Martha never asked what had happened to Anna's husband. She didn't need to. There were too many ways a man could be lost that winter. They had enough firewood for another 2 weeks, enough beans and dried root to make thin soup if they skipped every other meal. Martha rationed what little salt she had and steeped pine needles in hot water to fight off the scurvy. The smoke-blackened pots always had something simmering, even if it was just snow and bark steeped in bitter broth. The children never complained. They understood, in the way that starving children do, that every bite cost something. Every bowl was a prayer. The stone walls that once drew ridicule now glowed faintly at night, retaining the fire's warmth long after embers cooled. Martha had lined every crack with packed moss and thick wool, reinforced the roof where canvas had started to sag, and insulated the foundation with pine branches pressed tight against the outer edge and buried in snow. The heat couldn't escape. She knew how to make warmth trap itself. Still, it wasn't the warmth that truly saved them. It was the quiet order of things, the calm in the center of the storm, the certainty that there would be fire, that there would be someone to stir the pot, that someone would be up tending to the children when they cried out in the dark, that someone was watching, that someone was Martha. At night, after the little ones had fallen asleep, she'd sit near the door, rifle on her lap, eyes half closed. Anna would sit opposite, watching the fire. They barely spoke. Words had become like coal, too precious to waste, but occasionally their eyes would meet, and there was understanding there. Anna had taken to cooking what few meals they had. She was clever with flavors and softer with the children than Martha had ever been. Samantha, the eldest girl rescued from the grove, clung to her like a pup to a new mother, and Martha didn't mind. She hadn't built the cabin to be anyone's savior, only to survive, but now they were all surviving because of it. Still, the weight grew heavier with each passing day. In early January, a storm unlike any they'd yet seen came down from the Rockies. It rolled through in a white wall, fierce and fast, wind gusting strong enough to rattle the very stones. The snow piled so deep they couldn't open the door. Martha and Anna spent half a day tunneling through the stone-slit chimney just to let the smoke out. The cabin darkened as daylight disappeared behind a veil of snow thicker than fog. For 2 full days, the world beyond the walls was gone. Only wind and snow and the shifting groans of the roof. It was on the second night of that storm when the baby, Thomas, grew hot with fever. Martha had always feared this most. Not fire, not starvation, but illness, the kind you couldn't shoot or patch or fix with clever tricks. When Thomas cried out in the night with a cracked, dry-throated wail and his skin burned beneath her palm, she felt a kind of panic she hadn't known even during the first collapse of the south wall. She didn't say a word, just pressed a cold cloth to his head, rocked him, whispered songs. But his tiny chest heaved with labored breath, and by morning he was listless. Could be a lung sickness, Anna said gently, testing his forehead. Or it could be teething. He's still so little. Martha nodded, but her hands were shaking. She went out into the storm anyway. The stone foundation had held, but the chimney pipe was nearly choked with ice. The air in the cabin had grown damp, heavy. She needed air, needed heat to circulate. She wrapped herself in 3 coats, tied a scarf around her nose and mouth, and climbed the chimney from the outside, carving footholds into the drift. The wind nearly knocked her down. Her fingers went numb instantly, but she chipped at the ice with a bent ladle, then poured a pot of boiling water to melt the rest. The chimney cleared with a cough of smoke and a low moan like a dying animal. She fell twice on the way down. The second time, she didn't rise for a full minute, lay there face down in the snow, arms splayed, eyes closed. Then she heard Thomas crying faintly through the stones, and she rose. That night, the fever broke. His breathing eased. His color returned. Martha sat there for hours just watching him sleep, refusing to close her eyes. At some point, Anna laid a hand on her shoulder. Martha didn't flinch, just nodded once. Then they sat there together until dawn, but food was nearly gone now, and the stone walls that had held so much warmth could not feed the children's stomachs. They were down to bone broth and pine needle tea. Even the beans were nearly gone, and the root vegetables had turned soft with mold. There was no more lard, no salt, no oats, no hope for hunting with the snow near 6 feet in the valley. And then the roof began to drip. The storm had passed, but it left behind a cruel thaw. Daylight brought a biting sun that melted the snow just enough to seep through any seam, and the patched canvas atop the cabin, once so strong, had begun to rot. Martha noticed it first, while tending to the fire. A drop of water splashed the iron pot, then another, landing on her wrist. She looked up. A dark patch had formed in the center beam, sagging under snow weight. They had less than a day before it gave out. She couldn't reinforce it with timber. There was none left, but she had stone. She always had stone. With Anna managing the children, Martha worked without stopping. She climbed the chimney again, this time to haul slate she had set aside near the ridge months before, thinking it might one day come in handy. It did. Slate was heavy, cold, nearly impossible to wedge into place alone, but she laid slabs over the canvas roof like shingles, overlapping and securing them with iron spikes pulled from the remains of her old wagon. Where the beam sagged, she stacked stone pillars underneath, one in each corner of the hearth, and wedged them to take the weight. It was crude, but it held, and as the sun faded again behind more clouds, she stood on the slope, looking back at the thing they had mocked her for building. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't clean, but it was solid, and that was enough. In late January, the valley thawed just enough for wagons to start moving again. The first to reach her wasn't a wagon, but a boy on a mule, 13 at most, dirt-smeared, eyes wide, cheeks split from windburn. He came down the ridge clutching a note wrapped in waxed cloth, and held it out without a word. She took it, opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, the preacher's handwriting. Town near starved. One family gone, another left walking. We have nothing. If you have warmth, We'll trade anything, even labor. She stared at it for a long time, then looked at the children gathered behind her, her son sleeping in Anna's arms, the fire glowing behind them. She nodded. Tell them to come, she said. Bring shovels. They came in twos and threes, ash-faced farmers, weeping mothers, children wrapped in sacks. The strong carried the weak, the rest followed the smoke. Martha didn't speak to them, didn't welcome them. She just pointed to the slope and the piles of stone she'd gathered during the fall. Start building, she said. No one sleeps here unless they help. And they did. Together they built new walls around the first cabin, wider, broader, heavier, dug trenches for waste, built makeshift chimneys with salvaged brick, taught each other how to pack moss and seal gaps, how to trap heat and store warmth. By February, there were 3 stone cabins on the bluff. By March, 6, and at the center of them all, the original stone foundation stood strong, the one everyone had mocked, the one the widow built alone, with a newborn strapped to her chest, while the rest of the valley waited for her to fail. But no one laughed anymore. They called her Mother of the Ridge. They brought her gifts of food, tools, books. Some offered marriage. She declined. One man, Isaiah Boone, who once warned her she couldn't raise a child alone, came up with tears in his eyes, hat in hand. I was wrong, he said simply. Martha only nodded. Spring came late, but it came. When the ice melted and the first wildflowers bloomed, the bluff was no longer a mockery. It was a settlement, a haven, and every child who had slept beneath her stone roof that winter grew up knowing what a foundation truly meant, not just stone and mortar, but will and love and fire that refused to die. When the spring thaw reached the valley floor, it revealed more than just mud and roots. It revealed graves, simple ones, makeshift mounds, with no stone markers, no names carved, just sticks crossed or scraps of fabric fluttering from branches. There were too many to count. The storm had taken more than wind and firewood. It had taken nearly a third of the settlers in the region, and the rest had only survived because they'd found the bluff, because they'd come to the stone. By late March, the settlers no longer called it Martha's cabin. They called it the stone. Just that. Simple. Like it had always been there, part of the land, like a thing that had risen on its own. They didn't understand what had gone into it, the blood in the mortar, the frozen fingers, the teeth chattering through the nights she thought her child might die. But they knew it had saved them, and so they stayed. Martha never meant to lead anything. She never asked for followers. But when something holds fast while everything else collapses, people cling to it. And they clung to her, some with gratitude, others with guilt, some just because she had fire when they didn't. The bluff became a village by midsummer. Half of them still lived in tents or makeshift lean-tos lashed to the original stone walls. Others slept in dugouts or under canvas roofs, held up with ropes and hope. The ones who could build tried to copy her foundation, flat stone, sealed tight with clay and wool, hearth sunk deep to catch and circulate heat. Martha helped where she could, but she was no mason anymore. She had a son to raise, and that, more than anything, was her calling now. Thomas took his first steps that spring, right on the same hearthstone she'd laid with trembling hands one bitter morning when she still thought it might all collapse. News of the ridge spread. Traders stopped by out of curiosity. Soldiers passed through on their way to nowhere. A preacher came from 2 counties over just to see the bluff that stood, and asked if he could say a sermon in front of it. Martha let him, though she didn't attend. She was hauling stone for a retaining wall that morning. The Lord could wait. The next storm wouldn't. By June, the valley was green again. Chickens scratched the earth near where the baby from the grove, William, now helped Anna hang wash. Samantha had taken to scribbling letters in the dirt with a stick, and Martha noticed that she was spelling names. Names of the dead, names she remembered from the early days. The girl never said why. By then, there were 18 children on the ridge, 18 mouths to feed, 18 pairs of boots to find, 18 coats to patch, and hands to warm, but no one was dying anymore. Still, peace never lasts, not on the frontier, and not when others start noticing that one place had come through the winter without burying half its own. In August, the riders came. They weren't soldiers, not quite, former cavalry by the look of them. 5 men in long coats and worn boots, dust-covered and hard-eyed, the kind of men who rode in loose formation, not for formation's sake, but to make it harder to ambush. They carried carbines and long knives, and their horses were well fed in a way that didn't fit the times. They came up the slope slow, eyes taking in every new roof, every half-built chimney, every mother who stepped inside with her child at the sight of strangers. Martha watched them from the ridge, arms folded, jaw tight. Anna stood beside her. She whispered, "You want me to get the rifle?" "No," Martha said. "Let's see what kind of men they are first." The riders stopped at the stone foundation. Their leader, tall, grey-bearded, sun-scorched face, tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "we've heard tell of a village up here that stayed warm when the rest froze. Thought we might come see." "You've seen it," she answered. He smiled. "So we have." His eyes drifted to the roofline, the children peeking from behind the garden rows, the smoke drifting lazy from chimneys. Then they snapped back to her. "Any room for more?" "That depends," Martha said. "On what you're bringing." The man nodded thoughtfully. "Got some mules? Tools? Grain? Know how to shoot? Know how to build?" She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "You steal any of that?" "No, ma'am, but we might have taken it off some men who didn't need it anymore." He didn't smile when he said it. She didn't either. Finally, she nodded. "Your people follow our rules, which are, children eat first, everyone works, nobody takes what isn't theirs, we waste nothing, and we don't shoot unless someone shoots first." The man grinned. "Sounds civilized." "It isn't, it's survival." He dismounted. "Fair enough." The riders stayed. One built a windbreak for the cabins. Another dug a proper well. They never caused trouble. One of them, the quietest, ended up teaching the older boys how to sharpen knives and whittle. Another started a still that brewed strong tea from bark and wild mint. The leader, his name was Court, didn't say much after that first talk, but he often watched Thomas from a distance, and there was something in his face when he did. Not pity, not longing, just a kind of haunted awe. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the far hills, and the last fire of the day was being kindled, he sat near the hearth and finally spoke to Martha again. "My wife died in the freeze," he said. She didn't look at him. "My boy too." Still she didn't speak. He added, "I heard your story. A trader said a woman built a stone house so strong that winter couldn't break it. I figured it was a lie, but I rode anyway." Martha stirred the pot. "Most men laughed when I started. I'm not laughing." "No." A pause. He stood. "You ever think about leaving?" That caught her. She turned. "Leaving? This ridge, this valley, heading east maybe, to the rail towns, start new." She looked around, at the rows of drying clothes, at the half-finished smokehouse, at the new stone wall where 4 more cabins were planned. "No," she said. "I already started new, right here." Court nodded once and walked away. That night, Thomas cried again. Not in pain, just a child's cry, hungry or lonely. Martha woke fast and went to him. The hearth was still warm, and the stars through the vent glowed faint behind a thin cloud veil. She picked him up, held him close. He was heavier now, rounder, strong. She remembered the first night he lay in the crate by the fire, wrapped in a goat pelt, skin grey from cold. She held him tighter. "I built this for you," she whispered. The words hung there in the dark, like truth always does, unshakable, simple, full of weight. "I built all of this for you." The next morning, snow fell again. Just a light dusting, but enough to make every child shout and run. Enough to remind the ridge what had nearly killed them. Enough to remind Martha what she had survived. She walked out to the edge of the bluff, watched the valley below, and behind her the stone foundation, now the heart of a village, held its heat in silence. The wind shifted in April. Not the cold wind, the killing kind, the kind that stripped flesh and whispered of hunger, but a warmer, wetter breeze off the southern slopes, a breath of spring too stubborn to be denied. For the first time in nearly 5 months, the frost gave way to running water. Ice thinned on the river. Trees groaned and stretched with sap rising back into their bones. And on the ridge where they once said no woman had any sense building, smoke rose steady from 12 chimneys. 12. No one kept track of who was in charge anymore. It wasn't a town. It wasn't even a settlement, not in the official sense. There were no land deeds, no sheriff, no saloon, just cabins, fences, rows of sprouting roots in warmed beds, and a kind of quiet understanding that all of it had begun with a widow, a baby, and a decision no one else was brave or foolish enough to make. The newcomers had stopped calling her Martha. They called her the widow. And though the name carried sorrow, it carried weight, because she wasn't just a woman who'd lost something. She was a woman who'd built something, and she had done it while no one watched, no one helped, and no one believed. Thomas learned to walk on the stone floor. He toddled across the room, with the firelight glowing off his round cheeks, and let out peals of laughter that echoed off the same walls that had once echoed with nothing but wind. He was strong now, curious, always trying to climb things, drag pots across the room, or chew on bootlaces. He had 5 other toddlers around him. Now, children who had nearly died in the storm, children born during the thaw, children whose mothers still woke in the night just to listen for breath. Martha watched him with the kind of love that was too deep to smile about. It sat low in the chest, a warmth like coals, a knowing. She had given him not just life, but a future. In May, the first supply wagon from the east arrived. It came from a church group, following word that some high bluff near the forks held through the freeze. The 2 men who arrived with it expected to find a ghost town. Instead, they found gardens being tilled, fresh mortar set in new cabin walls, children washing at the creek, and a woman with soot on her sleeves and a baby on her hip building a drying rack with a hatchet and an iron nail. "You must be Martha Greeley," one said, clearly surprised. "I must be," she said, not looking up. They offered her Bibles, flour, blankets. She took the flour and the blankets, politely refused the rest. "We'd love to send word back east," the man said. "Tell your story." "Why?" He blinked. "Well, so others can hear it. It's inspiring." She did look at him then. "You think I did any of this to be inspiring?" "No," he admitted. "But folks like to know people survive, especially women." She narrowed her eyes. "Especially widows?" she asked. "Well, yes," she shook her head. "Tell them to send tools and boots for the children, nothing else." The man nodded. They never returned, but the tools did. By midsummer, the valley had changed. The old towns down below had mostly emptied. Some burned, others abandoned entirely. The freeze had broken their will. But on the ridge, they were carving out permanence. The foundation Martha built wasn't just literal anymore. It was cultural, habitual. Children knew to check the fire first thing in the morning, knew how to seal cracks, how to test for heat leaks, how to bank coals under ash to keep them alive overnight, knew that no one ate unless everyone had something, knew not to cry when it was hard, just to keep working. And their parents? They learned that following one woman's quiet, stubborn wisdom was better than waiting for the world to save them. Anna Coleridge, once a guest, became more than that. Not quite a sister, not a wife, not a friend exactly, something deeper. They never spoke about it directly. They didn't need to. But Anna stood beside Martha through every season, every new child brought in, every decision about what to plant, what to ration, what to build next. They shared the work and the fire. Late in the summer, a boy went missing. One of the older children, Caleb, had wandered into the lower grove in search of honey. He was gone for half a day, and when they found his trail, it vanished near a wash where the roots ran thick. Martha gathered a search party. 10 men, 4 women, 2 dogs. They didn't wait for dark. They didn't debate. They just followed her as if she'd always been leading. They found the boy trapped under a fallen tree branch, leg broken, calling hoarsely. They carried him back, and he lived. When his father tried to thank her, Martha just said, "Next time, don't let your boy go alone." The man looked chastened, but he nodded. Because on the ridge, they listened to her now. One night, a full year after the first stone fell, a storm rolled through the valley. Not snow, but rain, heavy, pounding summer thunder that rattled every rooftop for miles. Most of the new cabins held. 2 had roof leaks. 1 was still just a tarp over dug-out earth. But the stone cabin stood silent, warm, unshaken. Inside, Thomas was curled in the same hearth nest where he once nearly died, this time giggling at the thunder. Samantha sat nearby, braiding rope. Anna stirred something over the fire. Martha sat by the doorway, looking out into the storm, not afraid of it, not anymore. As she watched the lightning flash across the sky, she thought of her husband. She hadn't spoken his name in months, hadn't dreamed of him either. She loved him still, but she no longer needed the memory to stand. She had built something without him for their son, and in doing so, she had saved not just her own child, but dozens of others, families, futures. She placed a hand on the stone lintel above the door. It was warm, like always. The next morning, she walked down the slope alone. It was her first time going that far in nearly a year. The trail was overgrown, but she knew every step, every jutting rock, every root. She came to the spot where the first settlers had once laughed, where they watched her hauling stones alone, belly full, eyes hollow. She knelt there, touched the earth. There was a wildflower growing from the base of a stone she'd once dropped and left, too heavy to carry. Yellow petals, tall and defiant. She smiled and left it there. They came again in the fall. Traders this time. Officials, the kind who wanted to mark land, name roads, write laws. They asked what the place was called. One man took out a ledger and said, "We need a name for the registry." Martha thought about it. "Don't need one," she said. "Ma'am," he said, confused. "We can't file the territory if we don't name it." Anna, who had been standing nearby, finally spoke up. She looked toward the fire rising behind them, toward the circle of stone cabins, toward the ridge that had saved them all. "Call it Hearthstone." The man scribbled it down. Years later, maps would show a town called Hearthstone. Not a big town, but a lasting one. Stone homes, strong roofs, children who knew how to build, who remembered their mothers waking through the night to keep the fire alive, who taught their children how warmth wasn't just heat, it was effort, it was choice, it was sacrifice. And at the center of it all, still standing, was a cabin with a wide stone foundation, the first. Inside, a woman, in grey, sat on a worn wooden chair, a baby in her arms, her grandchild. She rocked slowly. The hearth glowed, and outside, the snow began to fall once more. But inside, they were ready. They always would be.